Thanks, everyone, for coming here. I'm sure speaking for Isaac, he would have been delighted to know that this many people turned out to honor his work. Being here in Morgantown gives me a kind of an odd feeling. In my novel, The Joymakers, I named an underground city, Morgantown. Of course, that Morgantown was on Venus, which is a bit more inaccessible than this one. I'm delighted to be here at West Virginia University, and so is my colleague, Chris McKitterick, whose first novel, Transcendence, will be published in a couple of weeks. But I'm particularly pleased to talk about my friend and literary model, Isaac Asimov, on this, the 90th anniversary of his birth in Petrovichi, Russia. Although it may have been as early as October 4th, which would mean that we were celebrating his 91st anniversary. But he would have been astonished at this kind of celebration. When I interviewed him for my book about his science fiction, he said, "Don't waste your time, write your own stories." But I told him that every scholar needs to write one book like this, and he was mine. Isaac was brought to this country at the age of 3 and grew up in a series of Brooklyn candy stores. That experience, he felt, shaped his later life. He did not regret the habits they instilled in him, with the possible exception of the social awkwardness created by never visiting anyone or having anyone visit the family, tied as they were to the unrelenting demands of the store. Because these kinds of experiences resulted in the adult, successful Isaac Asimov. And as he discovered, that was a very good thing to be. He found ways to cope with the larger world, at first with wit bordering on the smart alecky, and later with what he called gallantry to the ladies, which consisted of suggestive remarks offered as jests, and an overall air of amazement at his own success, coupled with a generous account of his own failings and the put-downs of his friends. In his school days, for instance, he recounted the occasion when Leigh Hunt's Abu Ben Adam was scheduled for discussion the next day. Ben Adam, who, if you will remember, whose name is not in the angel's tablet, as one who loves the Lord, asked to be written as one who loves his fellow man. And the poem ends, "And lo, Ben Adam's name led all the rest." Isaac was ready for the teacher's question. Why did Ben Adam's name lead all the rest? "Alphabetical order, sir," Isaac volunteered. He was sent to the principal, but Isaac recounted it was worth it. Isaac credited his transformation, for a knowing know-it-all into a genial comrade to an incident late in World War II. He did not get inducted until late in the war, but then he was sent to H-bomb tests in the Pacific. While sitting there waiting in a room, he heard a soldier telling a couple of other soldiers about how the bomb worked. He rose to assume the smart man's burden and offer the correct account when he asked himself who appointed him their educator and sat down. Ironically, a few years later, he assumed the smart man's burden by beginning a series of nonfiction books about almost everything that we celebrate today. That led Professor George G. Simpson of Harvard to call him one of our natural wonders and national resources. Before Isaac was a celebrated sage, however, he was a science fiction writer. And even in his later days, he wanted to be known as a science fiction writer. It is uphill to science fiction, downhill to everything else, he recommented. He wrote about attending a World Book meeting of contributors where each was introduced by an orchestral theme. To Isaac's chagrin, he was introduced with, "How deep is the ocean? How high is the sky?" And he said, "No matter how various the subject matter I wrote on, I was a science fiction writer first, and it is as a science fiction writer that I want to be identified." In the introduction to Nebula Award Stories 8, he wrote, "I began by writing science fiction, and for 30 years I found that my training in science fiction made it possible for me to write anything. I have written about 150 books as of now, and I tell you that of all the things I write, science fiction is by far the hardest thing I do." Isaac fell in love with science fiction in his father's candy store, which stocked newspapers and magazines. Isaac learned to read them so carefully they could be returned looking untouched, a habit that he retained until the end of his life. Among those magazines was a new kind of publication that had started when Isaac was 6 years old. It was Amazing Stories, it was called, then another magazine called Science Wonder Stories, and then Astounding Stories of Super Science. Isaac had taught himself to read at the age of 5, and Isaac's father always viewed his son with a sense of awe and a determination that his elder son would be a doctor. He ordered Isaac not to waste his time on such pulp magazines until Isaac pointed out the word science in the magazine's title, and then his father gave up. Isaac's father gave him a used office-sized typewriter when Isaac was 15, and Isaac put it to use immediately, writing letters to the science fiction magazines, commenting on the stories, particularly those in Astounding Stories, which had recently been acquired by Street & Smith from the bankrupt Clayton magazine chain. His fascination was intensified when John W. Campbell Jr. was named editor of the magazine in 1937 and changed the name to Astounding Science Fiction. Isaac decided then to start writing science fiction stories and, more importantly, to write them for Astounding Stories. Soon afterwards, Isaac discovered that the magazine was edited in Manhattan, only a subway ride away, and Isaac ventured in to meet the editor, John Campbell. It was the first of a series of meetings that would shape Isaac's developing mind and future. Campbell was patient and provocative about science, culture, and writing, and he was willing to talk by the hour to the inexperienced teenager, even reading the stories Isaac began bringing to him and pointing out their flaws at the same time he was rejecting them. The first story Isaac published, Marooned Off Vesta, when he was 19, however, was in Amazing Stories, and the second was there as well, but he counted the real beginning of his career from the story Trends he published in Astounding a couple of months later. That began a remarkable collaboration of editor and author that lasted 10 years, including Isaac's robot stories, his foundation stories, and his non-series stories, which included in 1942 his first story featured on the cover, a story called Nightfall, a publication which, although he didn't know it at the time, would establish his reputation as a major writer. The story illustrated the way in which the editor and the author worked together. Isaac had come to Campbell's office on one of his frequent visits, and Campbell quoted a sentence from Ralph Waldo Emerson's Nature. The sentence went, "If the stars should appear one night in 1,000 years, how would men believe and adore and preserve for many generations the remembrance of the city of God?" And Campbell said, "What do you think would happen, Asimov, if men were to see the stars for the first time in 1,000 years?" "I don't know," Isaac said. And Campbell replied, "I think they would go mad. I want you to write a story about that." The incident brings up a question about Isaac's writing style. Style, Todorov wrote, is what stands between the reader and the text. and Isaac wanted nothing to stand in the way. One of the first scholars writing about Isaac's work, a professor named Joe Petrush, commented that Isaac could write poetically when he wished, and he cited a paragraph near the end of Nightfall. Isaac replied that transparency was a style, and that paragraph that Petrush cited didn't prove that he could write poetically, since it had been inserted by Campbell and made no logical sense in the context of the story. But he never removed that paragraph from later reprintings. He also resented readers telling him that Nightfall was his best story, and suggesting that he write more stories like that, because he felt that he had learned a good deal about writing since he was 22. But when he incorporated himself, he did so under the name of Nightfall, Inc. Isaac had no fear of irony. Meanwhile, he had joined a fan group called the Futurians, one of many chartered by Hugo Gernsback's new magazine, Wonder Stories. The Futurians included Fred Pohl, Donald Walheim, Cyril Kornbluth, Richard Wilson, James Blish, Robert Lowndes, Damon Knight, Judith Merrill, and Virginia Kidd, fans who would help shape science fiction for the next few decades as writers, editors, agents, and even publishers. Isaac continued his education into college, not always happily, as he discovered that he could not get admitted to the right college. He was admitted, for instance, to Columbia Seth Junior College, and then to Columbia University, rather than the more prestigious Columbia College. He was also dismayed to discover that the wonder child, who had skipped several grades as a youngster, was not as good as some of his classmates at some subjects, and that he disliked anatomy and dissection. He discovered, for instance, that in his dissection class he had not only to dissect a cat but to kill it. He decided he did not want to belong to any profession that had to do that. He also discovered that he could not get into medical school and decided to study chemistry toward a graduate degree, interrupted by a period of military research at the U.S. Navy Yard in Philadelphia, where he served with Robert Heinlein and L. Sprague de Camp. That must have been quite an experience. All this time, Isaac was writing and selling stories regularly to Campbell. As a writer who had experienced financial struggles myself, I was surprised, and to be honest, somewhat pleased, to read in Isaac's autobiography that over these first 11 years, he had earned a total of $7,821.75, or about $710 a year. Isaac earned his PhD in 1948, and after a year of postdoctoral research at Columbia, was hired as an instructor in biochemistry at the Boston University School of Medicine. This was the year he wrote his first novel, Grow Old With Me, which Doubleday published as Pebble in the Sky in 1950. The same year, a fan publisher, Gnome Press, collected his first robot stories, as I, Robot, and followed that with his foundation books, all eventually taken over by Doubleday. It was the beginning of a relationship with Doubleday that lasted until his death, reaching its high point, for me at least, with The Caves of Steel in 1954 and its sequel, The Naked Sun, in 1957. Meanwhile, he had turned to nonfiction at Boston University, publishing his first scientific book, Biochemistry and Human Metabolism, in 1952, and progressed to his first solo text, The Chemistry of Life. He had been approached to write a book about science for teenagers. His career as a writer was taking off in surprising ways. Like H.G. Wells, he took delight in totaling his income by years and noticing how it increased. He had earned, for instance, $1,695 for his writing in 1949, more than $4,700 in 1950, $3,625 in 1951, and an astonishing $8,550 in 1952. That last figure, incidentally, was half again as large as his university salary, which had now reached the total of $5,500. By 1957, Isaac realized that he was primarily a writer. A new dean at Boston University School of Medicine asked him to devote more of his time to research. "My writing is my research," he insisted, but the dean persisted, and Isaac resigned everything except his title. By that time, he was a tenured associate professor. And he turned to full-time writing. Unfortunately for science fiction, he decided to devote his time to nonfiction. He attributed that decision to the launching of Sputnik, the first satellite by the Soviets, and the need for a greater emphasis on scientific education. But his nonfiction was a lot easier to write for him. More publishers were eager for it, and to be honest, they paid better. He wrote stories with some regularity, but he did not write another science fiction novel for 15 years. Isaac was so prolific as a nonfiction author that it is impossible to describe even a small proportion of his production. His fiction listing, for instance, covers 2 pages in the compilation that accompanied every autobiographical work. He delighted in keeping track. His anthologies, it should be admitted that Isaac not only delighted in the number of works he had published, but that toward the end of his career he padded the list with dozens of anthologies he edited with Martin H. Greenberg, the all-time champion of anthologists, and that section covered nearly 3 pages, but his nonfiction covered more than 5 pages. They are best described by categories, which helps as well to illustrate the astonishing scope of his interests. General science, typified by his Intelligent Man's Guide to Science, totaled 24 books. Mathematics was a measly 7. Astronomy, clearly a favorite, reached 68. Earth sciences, 11. Chemistry and biochemistry, 16. Physics, 22. Biology, 17. History, 19. The Bible, 9. Literature, 10. Humor and satire, including The Sensuous Dirty Old Man, that got Isaac an appearance on The Tonight Show, 9. Science essay collections, mostly from the monthly articles he wrote for the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, 40. Science fiction essays collections from the editorials he wrote from Isaac Asimov's magazine, 2. Autobiography, 4. And miscellaneous, 14. In all, 470 books, a record about which he was inordinately proud, and indeed one that may never be surpassed. At one time, he said he was writing a book a month. But his science books represented a significant contribution to a general awakening of the American public to the need for greater understanding of science if the U.S. was going to maintain its leadership in the world. In 1973, he pointed out in a film I made with him that we are living in a science fiction world, a world of spaceships, atomic energy, and computers, a world very much like the world that he and other science fiction writers had been describing a quarter of a century before. It was a world typified by the first moon landing 4 years before this statement was made. And he said about this, he said, science fiction writers and readers didn't put a man on the moon all by themselves, but they created a climate of opinion in which the goal of putting a man on the moon became acceptable. In I, Asimov, he described his prolificity. Once he turned to writing full-time, he averaged 13 books a year, and his books ranged over every category in the Dewey Decimal System. During a question and answer period, he gave a number of talks, often as many as 2 or 3 a week. He always, should be said, always gave them extemporaneously, which I wish I could do tonight. During a question and answer period, a man asked, if you had to choose between writing and women, Dr. Asimov, which would you choose? And Isaac answered instantly, Well, I can type for 12 hours a day without getting tired. And Barbara Walters asked him, off camera, what if the doctor gave you 6 months to live? What would you do? Type faster, Isaac said. Tackling as many topics as he did, Isaac depended upon information he could dig up. What I contribute to my books, he wrote in his autobiography, are 1, ease and clarity of style, 2, sensible and logical order of presentation, and 3, apt and original metaphors, analogies, and conclusions. Several moments in this remarkable period of productivity stand out for me. One was when I filmed a part of my literature science fiction series with Isaac in 1973. When Isaac learned that I shared an office with Professor Paul Kendall, a renowned Shakespearean scholar, he gave me one of his Shakespeare books to take back with me. I wondered how Paul would respond to that, but I must say he was pleased to get it. On another occasion, Isaac was invited to be part of a panel discussing the human brain at a meeting in Washington, D.C. He responded that he didn't know anything about the human brain. The inviter came back saying, "You must be an expert, you've just written a book about it." And Isaac said, "I'm an expert at sounding like an expert." And that was what Isaac did best. He sounded like an expert. He had a marvelous memory. In his childhood, he would read all his school books the first couple of days and never open them again. I asked him once about this, about his memory, and if he ever wondered how other people's memories worked or didn't work. And he said that in a meeting of Gilbert and Sullivan enthusiasts a year or so ago, he was reciting some lyrics and for a moment couldn't think of the next line. That was when he realized what many people not blessed with his recall experienced all the time. But even Isaac's memory was not infallible. He began including autobiographical notes when he took on the editing of the Hugo volumes and continued it into his own story collections. But when he wrote his enormous autobiography to mark the milestone of his 200th published book, he referred to the diaries that he had been updating every day since 1938 and discovered that he had to correct some of his own recollections. He had published Opus 100 with Houghton Mifflin to mark his first 100 books, and he thought it only fair to allow them to also publish Opus 200. But Doubleday was his first and still his major publisher, so Doubleday asked him to let it publish his autobiography. He protested that he had never done anything, but Doubleday insisted. A year later, he brought in a thick stack of manuscript and put it on the editor's table. When the editor didn't flinch, he went into the hall and returned with another stack just as big. The editor said, "But Isaac, what would you have written if you had ever done anything?" Isaac could even make a life of reading and writing, a fascinating account. To his memory, he added a good knowledge of where to find the information he needed, and he developed the ability to translate that information into narratives as readable and dramatic as fiction. He could make the difficult seem simple. In the book I wrote about him, I suggested that his fiction got its characteristic Asimovian flavor from the fact that it was written like science. It was all about the ideas. And his nonfiction got its readability from the fact that it was written like fiction. His science fiction also was distinguished by its rationality. When I wrote about him in The Road to Science Fiction, I titled the section "The Cool, Clear Voice of Asimov." His heroes were the most rational and had the longest view, like Harry Seldon, whose psychohistorical plans were intended to shorten 25,000 years of barbarism to 1,000. His villains weren't really villains, but rational people whose vision was too limited. And emotional responses were frustrations of the need to behave rationally. That's why two of his favorite stories are anomalies. His favorite story, for instance, was The Last Question, which, to be sure, is cool and rational, even though it ends with the phrase, "Let there be light." But his second and third favorites were The Bicentennial Man and The Ugly Little Boy, which are emotional and irrational, what I have called un-Asimovian. Those, of course, so effective as fiction that one has been made into a film and the other has been optioned. Isaac called their creation writing over his head, like the middle section of the gods themselves. Another difference between Isaac's fiction and his nonfiction was that his fiction was always optimistic. Solutions would be found, rationality would prevail. But Isaac's nonfiction, when it addressed the many problems that faced the world, like pollution or overpopulation or war, was pessimistic. It was a matter, he said, of dealing with the world as it is, the world in which irrationality is predominant. And he told me, I am trying to live a life of reason in an emotional world. In 1970, he wrote in a letter, I wish I could say I was optimistic about the human race. I love us all, but we are so stupid and short-sighted that I wonder if we can lift our eyes to the world about us long enough not to commit suicide. I keep trying to make people do so. But the year before this, he wrote, in considering the future society, let us assume that 1, there will be no nuclear war, 2, the population will increase but not disastrously, and 3, the trend toward automation will continue. In many ways, that's the way it's come out. He followed that by some predictions about work becoming more administrative and managerial, which would accelerate the trend toward sexual equality, and that the increased amount of leisure would provide a great emphasis on creativity, the topic of this series, and the purveying of amusement, he said. I suspect, he concluded, that in the 25th century, 1/3 of the human race will be engaged in supplying amusement to the other 2/3. Isaac's love for writing made him maybe a difficult husband and sometimes a detached father. When he received copies of his 41st book from Houghton Mifflin, he mentioned to his wife the possibility of reaching 100 books before he died. She shook her head and said, what good will it be if you then regret having spent your life writing books while all the essence of life passes you by? And Isaac replied, but for me the essence of life is writing. In fact, if I do manage to publish 100 books, and if I then die, my last words are likely to be only 100. On another occasion, his beloved daughter Robin asked him to suppose he had to choose between her and writing. Isaac recalled, he said, why, I would choose you, dear. And he added, but I hesitated, and she noticed that too. Isaac did return to writing science fiction novels with a novelization of Fantastic Voyage in 1966 and The Gods Themselves in 1972, which was certainly his most science-related novel, science-based novel. It's interesting to note that of all his writing, most of it is not about science itself. It's about speculative ideas like robots and future galactic empires, none of which is related particularly to science. Isaac is ranked, however, among hard science fiction writers, which means that the fiction is based on real science or on new developments in science, but certainly he was not the hard science fiction writer that Hal Clement was, or Larry Niven. Isaac's fiction was more philosophical, based on concepts like psychohistory or robotics, or the musings of Ralph Waldo Emerson. He also was fond of history, and the foundation stories are the fall of the Roman Empire writ large. The Gods Themselves, however, showed that Isaac could do hard science fiction when he wished. It began with the challenge of writing a novella about the impossibility of plutonium-186. In 1982, Isaac returned to his Foundation roots and wrote Foundation's Edge. His Doubleday editors insisted on it. Betty Prashker, his editor there, called him into her office and said, Isaac, We want you to write a novel for us. Isaac protested that he didn't write novels anymore. But Prashker said that they were going to send him a contract with a large advance. That frightened Isaac, who always signed for a small advance that allowed him the freedom to write what he wanted rather than what the publisher wanted. That evening, Doubleday editor Pat Labruto called to say that when Betty said a novel, she meant a science fiction novel. And when Doubleday said a science fiction novel, they meant a foundation novel. I can't help mentioning that Foundation's Edge was not only Isaac's triumph, it was his first bestseller, but not his last. It was my triumph as well. The greatest tribute a scholar can have, I have a feeling, is when his scholarship has a positive impact on his subject. And Isaac wrote that my book, Isaac Asimov, The Foundations of Science Fiction, had made Foundation's Edge possible. He wrote in the Isaac Asimov magazine's editorial page at the time when Foundation's Edge was being published, said, "I was on the edge of deciding it was all a terrible mistake and of insisting on giving back the money when, quite by accident I swear, I came across some sentences by science fiction writer and critic James Gunn, who in connection with the Foundation series said, 'Action and romance have little to do with the success of the trilogy. Virtually all the action takes place off stage and the romance is invisible. But the stories provide a detective story fascination with the permutations and reversals of ideas.' Oh well," Isaac wrote, "if what was needed were permutations and reversals of ideas, then that I could supply." Panic receded, and on June 10, 1981, I dug out the 14 pages I had written more than 8 years before. Let me conclude with my two favorite anecdotes about Isaac. Early in 1956, Isaac wrote me that he had just written a pornographic scene that the postmaster couldn't touch. This, of course, was more than 50 years ago when the Postmaster General was still declaring books obscene and refusing to allow them to be mailed. It wasn't until I read The Naked Sun the following year that I knew what he meant. In that novel, Lige Bailey, his agoraphobic detective of the Caves of Steel, is called to Solaria to solve an important murder case. Solaria has been settled by spacers who restrict their numbers to 20,000 on the whole planet, while the robot population has increased to 25 million. Solarians, as a consequence, have become claustrophobic and neurotically afraid of personal contact. But as Lige is completing his mission and saying goodbye to Gladia, the victim's widow, she strips off her glove and touches his cheek. It is, in the circumstances, truly pornographic. Finally, Isaac was stubbornly attached to his name, even though he was warned early in his life that it might cause him to suffer from prejudice and his stories to be rejected. When he was 5, he remembered, his mother considered changing his name to Irving, but he wailed in protest that he would never answer to any name but Isaac. Later, because his name had already appeared in print, John Campbell never asked him to use a pseudonym, as Campbell had sometimes done with other writers. His last name was not always easy for readers to spell or remember, and when it appeared in the letter columns as Asimov with a Z instead of an S, he was quick with a correction. So it happened that when he received his much-coveted Grand Master Award in 1987, I was there, and I approached after the event to inspect the award and congratulate him. His name had been misspelled on the award, Isaac Asimov. "Isaac," I said, "are you going to give it back?" "Not on your life," he replied. Isaac had triple bypass surgery in 1983 and was hospitalized in 1990 for a kidney infection and in 1991 for heart and kidney failure. He died April 6, 1992. He had often expressed the hope of dying with his nose caught between two typewriter keys. But at the end, he had lost the strength to write, and that for him may have been almost worse. He had already written a couple of inscriptions for his epitaph. One of them said, "It's not dying I mind, it's having to stop writing." And the other, "Wait, I'm not finished." In the epilogue to forward the foundation, his widow, Janet, noted that writing his last foundation novel was hard on Isaac because in killing Harry Seldon, he was also killing himself. The first paragraph of that novel ends, "It has been said that Harry Seldon left this life as he lived it, for he died with the future he created unfolding all around him." That could have been written about Isaac himself. Thank you.
We'll open the floor now to questions. The ambassadors have microphones, so just feel free to raise your hand. We'll go ahead and get started.
Isaac would appreciate it if you'd ask a question.
Yeah, one here.
What's your favorite memory of Isaac?
Well, I had the opportunity to have a car ride from New York to Cleveland for the World Science Fiction in Cleveland. It must have been about 1955, 56. I had been in New York, and our mutual publisher, Marty Greenberg, offer was driving Isaac and Horace Gold's wife from New York to Cleveland, and he invited me to go along with him. So I got to ride with Isaac. He was guest of honor at that convention, the farthest he'd been away from New York, I think, except for his wartime experience. He didn't like to travel, didn't fly till much later in his life. So I that was probably the longest period I spent with him. And I remember sitting on a sofa in the lobby of the hotel, and we were chatting. He said, "Why is it," he said, "we spend the greater part of our lives with people who don't know us and don't understand what we do, so we can spend 3 or 4 days with the people who we really love." And I guess that was my favorite memory of Isaac.
You mentioned that Isaac spent some time with Robert Heinlein on a military base.
Yes.
Are you aware of how long, what duration of time they spent together, or what ideas were exchanged between the two of them?
Nobody has written much about what they talked about, but I know they did talk a lot about science fiction. Heinlein himself had gone through the Annapolis Academy and been commissioned as an officer, but developed tuberculosis and was never able to serve. And he always regretted that. He had a great admiration for people who served in the military, and he kept trying to get back in during World War II. And being unable to do so, he volunteered for research duty at the Navy Yards in Philadelphia, and he actually recruited DeCamp and Isaac Asimov to come and work with him, and actually there met his second wife, who was a naval officer as well. And but there was a marvelous little story that was published in Isaac Asimov's magazine, I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago, about the kind of experience they might have had of inventing a marvelous ship and the adventures they went on together. Alas, that was all fantasy, unfortunately. But Isaac remembered it as a great experience. And there was a great deal of science fiction talk, I'm sure, among the efforts they made to do research. But much of this was secret and never has been revealed, though you may find some references to it in the new autobiography that's been written of Robert Heinlein, which I've read in manuscript, and is very, very informative and readable. And you might find something there that would answer your question.
First off, thank you so much. The question I have is, did Isaac, are his children perhaps following in his footsteps? Did he inspire anyone in his family to write?
No, I don't think his son. He was always kind of protective of. He didn't feel that he was capable of making his way in the world. Not that he was not. He was handicapped in any way. Just socially, he seemed to not fit in, and so he was always concerned about taking care of him. His beloved daughter Robin, I think, went into never really showed any particular interest in writing, but had a career of her own.
Are there any science fiction writers or speculative fiction writers that are contemporary today that you think are sort of creating this ripe environment that as Isaac Asimov created for real scientific and technological development?
There are some remarkable new writers these days, and they're doing some quite different things. Particularly, I think you might note there are a lot of particularly British writers who are really demonstrating some unique abilities and ideas. But most of their writing tends to blur the boundaries between science fiction and fantasy, like China Mieville's New Weird, it's called, and Ian Banks' Culture series of the far distant future. Not so much like the Foundation series, but far more violent, I guess. A conflict of ideas rather than a working out of ideas. But I don't think there's anybody who is right now writing the kind of things that Isaac was. And I just wish there were.
Hey there. I was curious. What was Isaac's and I guess your opinion on like televised and film science fiction at the time, like Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica? Did they watch it? Did you watch it? Did you watch it?
Televised? Yeah, he was fond of Star Trek, and I'd never heard him talk about or write about Star Wars, but I presume I don't know, he probably liked that too. Though I don't know how many movies he actually went to, but he was asked to write the novelization of Fantastic Voyage, and initially didn't want to do it because he said that was not what he did, and he wasn't that much of a moviegoer anyway, but was persuaded to do so, and it turned out to be a good novel, actually a better novel than the movie, but that's not uncommon in this business. One of the basic problems with filming of science fiction is that science fiction is a medium of ideas. And one of the maxims of the film business is you can't film an idea. I don't agree with that. I think if you look at the first 26 minutes of 2001, for instance, how many of you have seen 2001? Good proportion of it. Well, this first 26 minutes is totally without dialogue. It's all about a proto-human creatures, ape-like creatures who live around a waterhole and are driven away from the waterhole by another tribe of proto-humans. And they eventually, at the end of this scene, one of the people, the tribe that are driven away, picks up a taper bone and begins pounding with it. And he pounds the other taper bones, and they fly in the air. And eventually he goes and takes his taper bone and uses it as a weapon to drive away the other tribe from the watering hole. And finally, at the end, there's an image of he's hitting a taper on the head and it collapses. Finally, at the end, he throws the bone triumphantly in the air, and it turns into a spaceship. And even without a single word, we have, it seems to me, this basic. In the midst of that, also, he touches the monolith, the black monolith. I should mention that. But we get, without a single word, the idea that in the picking up of this bone is the and the using it as a tool, the whole future of human technology is embedded, and it is in that act is the realization of the spaceship. And when they say you can't film an idea, I think they just mean they don't want to film ideas. And in my own case, and when they took my novel The Immortals, which is really about the way in which the actual realization that immortality is possible will shape the society. And they took it and turned it into a chase story in which the person, in my novel, the man who is changed, mutated, goes into this hospital to sell a pint of blood, and turns out to be used to it rejuvenates a millionaire, and then he has to try to run away before it gets killed, and process of trying to use him up. Well, they made my hero, who was really a bum to start with, they made him into a test car driver. And he goes in, he volunteers to go in to give his blood, doesn't sell it. And then when they tell him this millionaire wants him to come and talk to him, he says, well, he'd just been up to see some children, ailing children in the hospital. He said, maybe I could help them, he said. And it's this kind of sentimentality that gets sold, unfortunately, and often, not always, but often when they try to turn a science fiction story of ideas into something they think is far more viable. And so it's very, very, and well, Isaac was never well served, hasn't been well served by any of the movies that were made from his work, with possibly the exception of The Bicentennial Man, which I thought was not too bad. It was pretty good. But, I, Robot had nothing at all to do with his novel. And they did a TV film, I think, of some of his other work, of Nightfall, I believe. It was terrible. But anyway.
I'm teaching Nightfall in spring.
Good.
I'm sitting here puzzling over the paragraph by Campbell.
Yes. Can I refer to? Yeah. After at the end of the story, this planet, which experiences nightfall only once every 2,000 years, and there is a scene in an astronomy building where these astronomers are waiting to experience this, and they think they're superior to the rest of the population. But when finally the night falls and the suns go out through a eclipse, they see the stars and they too go mad. It's unfortunate. But there is that paragraph which begins, unlike Earth's puny 6 million or 6,000 stars, which are visible. I forget the number. I think it's around 6,000 stars, which are visible in the night sky. 10,000. This was the center of a galaxy where 10,000 stars blazed from the sky, and it continues in that kind of poetic vein for that whole paragraph. And Isaac's objection to that not only was it not his style, but he said there is no mention of Earth in this whole story. And the moments that's mentioned, it takes the reader out of the particular astronomical situation where this can become a reality. So I don't know how much of that objection was totally sincere, but he did mind having that attributed to him as compared to his usual plain, ordinary, transparent style.